You're listening to In Sickness, a podcast about caregiving with Allison Breininger and Justin Bima.
Hey, Justin, how are you today?
I'm doing okay. It's been some beautiful summer weather here. We have our
Nice.
long, the sun seems like the sun sets at like 9 o'clock at night. So it's these beautiful, long, sunny days. And yeah, like I've said before, I'm overall feeling pretty good.
Still?
Which is
every time you say that, I'm like, oh, yes.
I know. It's been remarkable. And so that's been, just a real blessing, and still trying to kind of like ride that out. I'm still working through some TMS to kind of try to really drive home the benefit.
Sure.
But yeah, feeling pretty good, feeling hopeful.
Wow.
Which is a really great feeling. Yeah.
Yeah. This is, and actually this will tie into something we were going to talk about today, but like, do you feel like in these moments, are you good at being like, okay, it's good right now? Like, yes. And like holding on to that? Or are you like, well, it's good today, but tomorrow could be garbage? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
How are you with that?
I think I'm doing okay with that. I think there is a kind of something learning over the years of dealing with depression and all this is like, and when things are good, like really relishing that, because, they may not always be that way.
Yeah.
As frustrating or whatever that feels like, but it's like, it's also building the memory of times when I'm not feeling super depressed as hopefully something to hold on to if and when the harder times come back, as a reminder that things are not always that way.
Wow.
So
do you hear how healthy that all was, what you just said? Ooh, that was like top notch healthy. Everything you just said.
Well, and I mean, it's putting it into practice is maybe different than
sure
verbalizing it, but yeah, that's kind of the goal.
Wow. Go you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Because I could see that it would be, and this is probably my catastrophizing brain, but like, it's like when something's good, I have to work really hard, to be like, okay, it's good. Okay, enjoy it. And not to be like, well, it's good right now, but how long is this going to last? Or we're going to jinx ourselves by saying it's good, or you know what I mean? All of that. And so I love that you are working to be able to relish it and sort of like snapshot it to be like as a little photo album for later, to come back to. So, wow. Thank you for modeling that for us.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And I'm just so glad that you're still doing well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Every time I ask, I sort of like hold my breath a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, how's he doing? And then you're like, because for so long you were like, well,
that's
so
right.
good. So it's so great that you are doing well. And of course, I will be here with you if there are moments that are not great. So
thank you.
Yeah.
What about you? How are things going over there?
Oh gosh, we are. I feel a little whirlwindy at the moment. We've had a lot of things. I can't remember what we last talked about here, but we had yet another death. And I don't remember where we were when I told you all that, but Sean's uncle passed away tragically. So we spent a week in Indiana. That was a whole thing because it was the first time we had been back there since Sean's mom passed away, and staying at their house and all that. So that happened. Then we like got Maya through the end of the school year by her like fingernails, man. We just barely got through that. And then right as soon as school ended, the three of us flew off to Michigan. We dropped her off at this arts camp in Michigan in the woods. And then Sean and I got to stay with my brother and his family at their lake cottage on Lake Michigan while Maya was at camp. And it was so beautiful. I mean, it's, I love Lake Superior so much, or Minnesota Lake, but Lake Michigan, it's like a close second, man. It just is like, oh, so pretty. And I've talked about this before. I'm just a better human when I'm near water. And we were right on the water. So I could just be like, oh, I want a kayak. Okay, here I go. I'm going to kayak. Like, come on, really? It was dreamy. It was really dreamy. So we had a super relaxing week. And then picked Maya up from camp, and she was really sick, and that was a bummer. And then we flew home, and now we're home for like 2 days. And then tomorrow, Sean and I fly to Maine for, it's called Camp Sunshine, which is a really fabulous camp in Maine where they every week of the summer have a different sort of disease group that they support. And so this is the FA Fanconi Anemia Week. And so I'm going to lead all the support groups for the caregivers. So we leave tomorrow. So that's a lot.
It's a whirlwind.
It is. And in the midst of all that, when we were on vacation in Michigan, night 2 of like 7 or 8, Sean was sort of like touching his neck. And I was like, what's going on? And he's like, I feel like my neck is swollen. And I looked, and sure enough, like the whole side of his face, neck was swollen. And it was on the same side where he's had tongue cancer, throat cancer, gum cancer, all on this one side.
Right.
All swollen. It was a Saturday night. And so fortunately, we have this amazing doctor who like we have on speed dial. So I waited till the morning. It was still swollen in the morning. And I texted her some photos, and she called me back at 7 a.m. on Father's Day, Sunday morning.
Wow.
And talked through it with me, asked a bunch of questions, sent in a prescription. We were able to pick that up, and then she said, I'm going to check in with you every morning and night for the rest of the week. And then the moment you get off the airplane, I want you to come see me.
Wow.
So that was like a miracle, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise I think I don't know, we may have, who knows what we would have had to do.
Right.
But just knowing that she was like looking at pictures twice a day, and she was checking with us, and she was talking to other people, and all of that was so helpful. So that was a huge part of then when we got home, racing from the airport to the doctor's office, because it was like 4:30 p.m. on a Friday. And she was like, yeah, I'm going to stay and wait for you guys, even though the clinic will be closed. So that was amazing.
Yeah.
So she thinks that it's called the parotid gland, which is like one of we all have them, like a salivary gland, but it can get all blocked up and swollen when you've had radiation in that part of your body. So she thinks that that's what it is, but she still wants to run some CT scans just to be sure. But of course, we're leaving town. So the CT scans won't happen until we're done. So that was just a whole thing, right? Of like that just being in the background, and something that I noticed that happened in my brain. Okay. My awesome brain is that night, he's like, my whole side of my neck is swollen, and I've been doing a lot of like advocacy work lately in the head and neck cancer community. And so I hear a lot of stories about like lumps and bumps and how things start. Right.
Right. And
so hearing him say that, and then like going to sleep, and then thinking like, okay, we're going to wait till the morning and see how it is in the morning. But my brain just automatically went to like all the worst case scenarios. And so thinking about like, okay, this is probably cancer. I mean, which sounds catastrophizing, except not when you're me. And this is like the life that we've had, right? Like I have a lot of reasons to think that. So this is probably cancer. And then what does that mean? And then my brain actually and I'm just going to be real honest here, like went to things like, okay, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the thing. And even, how when we had Death Doula Jane on. Yeah. And she was like, you're sitting on the dock and boats come by. And one of those boats is the one that you're going to get on, and it's going to be the end. Right. And my brain was like, maybe this is the boat. And like I went all the way like, okay, what's life going to look like when Sean's gone? How much money is in our life insurance? What is the negative space going to look like? What is like, my brain went boom all the way down that path that night. Yeah. And I mean, it's like this dress rehearsal kind of thing that my brain did. Yeah. And, whether that's healthy or not, I don't know. I don't know that it's one way or another. Right. Yeah. I mean, it's good that I'm not in denial about any of it. Right. I mean, would you say that this is like that was a wasted energy spent on that? But at the same time, many of those things that I was thinking about will eventually happen. Right. Right. Yeah. So anyway, that brings us to today's topic. Yeah. Which is anticipatory grief. Right. And I talk about this topic a lot at different webinars that I do. And I love it because it's the kind of thing that when people hear about it, they're like, oh, yeah, I've been having that or thinking that or doing that. And I didn't know there was a word for it. Right. But I think that what I was doing that night was exactly that. I was anticipating the grief that I am going to feel. I was anticipating this thing that may not. I mean, some of those parts may not happen. Some of them will, right?
Right.
And I was already grieving these things that haven't happened yet.
Yeah.
Which is kind of how it's defined, right? It's we think about it as like grieving someone's death, but it can also be grieving other things that we think like that's probably not going to happen and I'm sad about that, or that probably is going to happen and I'm sad about that. So it's sort of like grieving future things before they happen. Yeah. Is this a term that do you have familiarity with it, anticipatory grief? Like with it as a term? Is it something you've experienced?
It's something that as a term I'm familiar with. I think probably as part of when I started kind of trying to learn more about caregiving and kind of connect with the caregiving community, for lack of a better term, like that's a phrase that I came across, I think.
Okay.
And it's, I think we touched on it briefly back in our second episode on grief. It's been a while since we've talked about grief. I think, but yeah, it's something that I feel, and kind of in a different sense. It's not where it hits me isn't with like losing Sarah or Sarah dying, because her condition isn't a terminal condition. Sure. So like that's not there as much. But where I really feel it is because we weren't able to build a family, to have kids, like thinking to the future of being old and like who's around us, and feeling like that's going to be a lonely time, or, because I look to, my grandparents had, all of their kids and grandkids. And like, now I see that with like my parents, they have their kids, and, my siblings have their kids. So it's like this big family unit. And I like grew up like with a lot of that family stuff. Yeah. And so to kind of know that that's not going to be the case, but also, I don't know what that time is ultimately actually going to look like, and who is going to be around us in that time. But certainly that's where this sort of grieving the future comes into play for me. Yeah. Yeah. That's a powerful example. Thank you for sharing that. Because I think it's true that we often just think about it in relationship to death, but it's so much more than that, I think too, like as some other kind of examples is because I did a little, reading about this before we talked about it. And, if you're, as from a caregiving perspective, if the person you're caring for has like a degenerative disease or is like their dementia is starting to kind of progress, it's like you're losing part of who they are right now. Sure. And like, maybe it's not going to, it's not yet to the point where it's like death is the thing that you are like super on your mind, but like, is this the last conversation I'm going to have with them where they really know who I am, or like knowing that in the future that we're going to have these conversations and are, they're not mentally, they're going to be in a different place. Yeah. And that's whole nother level of loss. It is. And actually there's there's a term for that called ambiguous loss. And that I think relates to that, where it's like the person is still there, but you've lost part of them. Or sometimes ambiguous loss is related to like if a person, let's see, they are like, lost at sea or in the war or whatever, and they never like find the remains, right? There's never the resolution. So it's called ambiguous loss. But I think it's like, it's this writing on the wall thing, right? If you have this Alzheimer's diagnosis, you kind of know that at some point you're going to have this loss of like mentally, they will not be there the way they used to be. Yeah. And so knowing that, you start to grieve that beforehand because you know it's going to happen. Yeah. I think somebody said to me once, a caregiver said, I think that when my husband dies, like people are going to think I'm so cold-hearted because I'm not going to grieve. I'm not going to cry because I've spent all my time grieving now. Right. And I was like, oh, friend, I have bad news. Like, unfortunately, it's not like one or the other. Like, you grieve so much now that afterwards you're just like, well, I did that. Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's not like we have like a grief quota, right? Yeah. It's like we often do both. Right. Because it's a grieving in a different way. We're like future grieving. But that doesn't mean that the loss itself or the moment itself is still not hard. Yeah. It's just that we have this little crystal ball a little bit.
I think I've been thinking a lot about this because, as I mentioned, Sean's uncle died really unexpectedly and tragically in an accident, and versus Sean's mom, who, had this cancer diagnosis, and we had, sort of saw it coming far down the road, but then also they were sort of like, okay, now we've got about some weeks left. Now we got some days left, and so like how those are different. And I think that there's good and bad in both, right? Of course, so tragic that his uncle just like poof, like gone. Yeah. But also like there wasn't any of this, like the thinking about it and the worry, you know what I mean? And so I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong. I'm just saying that they're different, and that when we are in these chronic illness scenarios, we sort of have this, like we can see this path in a way that others cannot. Yeah. Or others maybe don't imagine because it's not in their forefront, Yeah,
I was thinking about that. The sense, like you said, if I have all of this anticipatory grief, is that going to lessen the grief after the fact? And like you said, like that's not how it works. And what I do wonder, though, if as you're feeling this anticipatory grief, this, feeling what's coming, if that is a time that you can use to, and not that you have to make every experience you're going through like somehow productive, but if you can get familiar with your grief or get to know your grief, learn how to give your grief space in your boardroom, like we talk about, if that will help your grieving process after the fact. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think anything we can do to better understand sort of what our triggers are and what our responses are and what works for us, all of that is good practice, right? So even thinking about, okay, when this thing happens, that sort of sets me off. Or when I am feeling grief, I feel it here in my body, or it shows up in this way. Yeah. That can help us sort of navigate those situations and those scenarios the more we do it, but also to be like, okay, when this happened and I felt this way, what ended up eventually feeling supportive was ... right? So with any of our emotions, it's just like the more we dig into it, I think the better more equipped we're going to be. Right. And so even though grief is going to show up potentially differently and might feel different, or there might be a different trigger or whatever, we're just going to be smarter about and more attuned to the way our bodies and our emotions work if we start that now, Right. When I think about triggers, I think they could be things like, I mean, the thing is they are like all these like day-to-day things that we probably don't think about when we think about anticipatory grief. So it could be like, for you potentially, like maybe it's like going to a baby shower, right? Or a Father's Day thing or something like that, right? That you might be like, okay, we have processed this part, but then you haven't maybe processed the like seeing the grandparents at the baby shower, right? And so maybe seeing the grandparents at the baby shower, and that all of a sudden is like, this like knife to the gut kind of moment for you, right? I know that like for us, sometimes seeing, like if we see like a college graduation announcement, right? Or a wedding thing, it's like, will he be here? Right. Or when Maya goes through those things. Right. Yeah. So it's like this happy thing that you might not, you're like going to the graduation party and you're like, here we go. And then all of a sudden you're like, why do I feel panicked or crying or this or that? Or like, and then, so it's to understand and be aware of like, oh, that's because I'm seeing the dad of this graduate. Yeah. And part of my brain is thinking like, what if our graduation party looks different? Right. So it's being aware of those things, right? And I think then also giving ourselves grace. So the more we can understand some of those triggers, the more we can sort of prepare ourselves to like, do I want to go to that graduation party? Yeah. Or if I go, like, what are the things that I can do before or during or after that might be supportive of me so that I can still go to the graduation party? Or and maybe it's just being aware, like, I'm going to go to this. Yeah. These feelings might come up. That's okay. They're welcome, Right. Because sometimes at least knowing it, as opposed to like being at this random party and being like, why do I feel really strange right now? But at least if we know it, Yeah. There was a caregiver I was talking to once who's about our age, married, and he said he was riding his bike and he saw this old elderly couple walking hand in hand. And he saw them and his brain was like, that's not going to be you and your wife.
Right.
And it just totally threw him for a loop. And he said it took him like 2 or 3 days to kind of like get out of the funk that just seeing that couple did. And of course, he had no way of knowing that he was going to see this couple. He couldn't have avoided that, right? But I think that the giving ourselves the grace of seeing those things, whereas for some people it would be like, oh, look at that, look, that's going to be us someday, right? That's like can feel the opposite for some of us, and so just to be aware of like, I saw this, I'm feeling like this. Here's why. It makes perfect sense that I feel like this. It's okay that I feel like this. And then maybe are there some things that I can do to help myself process through that? Because it's not like never leave the house again, you know? But what is it, you know, what is it that we can do, you know?
So I kind of wonder about, you know, you mentioned these various triggers potentially that can set off this anticipatory grief.
Yeah.
And as you like kind of learn to identify those, where is the balance between I don't want to feel this grief and avoiding those triggers versus this is something that I need to process? And there's probably not an easy answer for that. But it's a tough thing because it's painful to like look ahead and not see the future that you thought or see a future that's so different than everyone else. And that's not a fun place to be, but also, avoiding it, I don't think is going to be beneficial either. And certainly for me, it's knowing that you mentioned Father's Day, and it's not the same every year. Some years it doesn't feel like it hits as hard. Some years it really feels like it hits hard. And so that's like, you know, I know that, you know, maybe stay off social media that day. Don't do that. And I know that like the holidays can be hard too. And just kind of having that awareness can be helpful. I wonder too about where the balance is, or there's this tension between I am grieving this future that I won't have and living the moment that I'm in right now.
Yeah, exactly.
And I have this time with my person now, and I want to fully be present for that and cherish every bit of that I have right now. But also all of these things are reminding me of a future that is deeply painful. And how do you navigate that? Because I think that both of those things are important things to be present to, whether it's the moment you're in versus the grief. And it's, you know, one of those is probably a lot more enjoyable to be with, but like, because we can't avoid the grief, but we also don't want to lose ourselves in that and miss the time that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I always think of it as almost like a game of like tug of war. Right. It's because you said tension, right? And it is this tension of being pulled. And you said one of those is more enjoyable, but sometimes it isn't if it's almost like fake. Do you know what I mean? If it's just like, everything's fine, everything's always going to be fine. Yeah. Right. It's like, it's not really, you know, enjoyable. And so I think of it as like sort of this pull between like, you want to have hope. Yeah. But you also want to have acceptance, right? You don't want to be so blinded by hope that like, then something happens and then you're like, wait, what? I was not prepared for this. But then you also don't want to be so in your acceptance that you're like, that everything's terrible and nothing's ever good is going to happen. Right. So that's one sort of pull that I see. And another is sort of that like enjoying the moment, like you said, versus anticipating the loss. Yeah. And that can feel like a lot of pressure to be like, okay, if he has a shorter lifespan, we have to enjoy every single minute. You know, and I see all these things of people who are like, I'm doing my bucket list and I'm living my life to the fullest. And so sometimes I'm like, Sean, do you want this? He's like, oh, that sounds like a lot of work. And I was like, exactly. I'm just checking to make sure. Right. You know, and so I think we can do both. I think the healthy thing is maybe the yes and, right? Yeah. And even like what you said this morning as we first started talking about like almost like taking the mental pictures of the times when it is good, so that when a time is hard, you've got that like photo album, you know, proverbial photo album to look back on. So I think it's both. I mean, I think that like, was I that night when my brain went like all the way down the path, was I like not trusting? Was I giving up hope? Was I, no, I mean, not necessarily, because there's part of my brain that's like, this is maybe nothing. And, you know, there's still lots of things that can be done. But I think letting my brain go there is a healthy thing, because I feel like it's gotta go there too. If it goes there and it stays there,
right,
like, I think that's where it's a problem, right? And so I think it's again that like, how can we kind of float back and forth and visit both sides as we need to, and have sort of a healthy dose of each, and not get stuck in one or the other, you know?
Right.
And certainly some people, I mean, their coping mechanism is like blindfolds on, and like, I'm only going to be in hope, and I'm not going to think about what this says, and I'm not going to look at the research, and I'm not going to, and I mean, if that feels okay to you and that feels like what you need, like, okay, right? I'm not going to be like, well, look at the real facts here, man. You know, like, but I guess I would just ask, what is it that's putting you in that space? Is it that you feel like you're not allowed to think about the hard things? Like, have you just been bright-sided so much? Do you feel like you know, are those feelings there and you're just shoving them down? You know, like, what's the reason for only staying on the one side of the rope and not ever letting yourself go to the other, is something I would wonder. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, for you that night when you went down that path, like, how did that feel the next day? Like, was it, I don't know, like I don't know, this doesn't feel like the right word, but like a healthy exercise or something, like to have thought through all of that? Or was there like the hangover from like the feeling all of that grief?
Sure. Yeah.
Or kind of what did that in the following days kind of, did that stick around, or how did that manifest?
Good question. I think that in a weird way, I went there in sort of like a cold, detached way. Like, it wasn't like this, oh, it's not gonna happen. Right. It was just like, okay, well, this might be the ship. This might be it. And then life will look like this. And then this will probably happen. And then, you know what I mean? It was sort of just this like disembodied kind of, you know what I mean? Detached from emotion, sort of logistical, like, these are the next steps that might happen. Right.
Right.
And so it didn't feel like this, like, grief in that sort of like emotional sort of way. It was more like a logistical grief, you know? So I don't know if it helped my brain to sort of paint to the worst case scenario, because then, like, when it wasn't the worst case scenario, it was like, okay, cool, I've prepared for that, you know? But what I realized is that, like, the other times he has had these diagnoses, it was almost kind of like an immediate, like I'm in the room, we look at the scope, we see the stuff in his throat, we're like, oh crap, right?
Right.
We see the thing on his tongue and we're like, oh crap, you know? Whereas this was sort of this like in between,
right?
Like, we've got swelling, it could be a thing, it could maybe not be a thing, we're not really sure. And so I think that's interesting that then my brain went doot, 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 you know, like, even though it wasn't sure, but it was more like, well, I'm going to prepare us just to be sure. I'm going to prepare us for this worst case scenario kind of thing.
Yeah. I just want to pause a minute, and like, you've kind of talked about some pretty heavy stuff that you live with.
Yeah.
And I just want to acknowledge that and just say that, like, I'm sorry that that's the reality that you live in.
Thank you. Yeah.
That must be really hard.
Yeah. Thank you. I know it's interesting when I find myself saying some of these things so, like, nonchalantly.
Right.
Because it's just like what we do and what we say, and like, oh yeah, well, he's far past the median age of death, which was 32, and now he's 44, you know, like, and so it's weird that I've had practice saying these things nonchalantly. And so I appreciate you taking the space to be like, whoa, you know, because it's true. Like, that's not what most people are like lying in bed thinking about.
Yeah.
You know, but that is part of our reality. And so thank you for taking the space to acknowledge that. Because it's a lot.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. And I think, you know, a question I have for all of us is sort of like, where does it show up in our bodies. And so with that question, I think an interesting thing that I've realized is that I wonder if, for me, like I said, it doesn't, like if it's like a shut off kind of,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? Like a detached
Right.
disassociation, not dissociation, because I think that's more mental, because I feel like mentally I'm there, but it's not like panic or sadness or whatever. It's just sort of more like, just like I just go into almost like crisis mode in my brain. And I'm like, okay, here's the next thing that's going to happen. You know what I mean?
That's a mode that your brain is used to. There's a space your brain knows how to exist in.
That pathway is real dug in.
Yeah.
It's a lot of practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that, I mean, there's that kind of thing. And so, I mean, that's another example, right, of a trigger, is that like sometimes a new diagnosis of some sort, like we've been in a pretty quiet season. And so a new diagnosis is also a thing that can trigger you back into reality of like, oh no, this is still a thing, you know? And also I think, we've gone to a lot of funerals lately, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the most recent one we went to was a person who died of Fanconi anemia, who was just 3 years older than him, lives here in the Twin Cities. And so, that's another thing to like go to a person's funeral and then be watching and thinking like, okay, well, when it's, okay, so then there's the husband. So then in this case, would that be me? And would I be standing there? And you know what I mean? It's like, again, this like dress rehearsal that I think that people might do if they go to like a 90-year-old's funeral and be like, oh, I wonder what my funeral will be like. But this feels really different when you can see something that's going to be so similar. Yeah. And it's this dress rehearsal of like, whoa, what's his going to look like? Like, oh, what a terrible sentence. Yeah. To be thinking that. And I think, I want us to think that it's healthy to think it and to not just be like, it's fine. He's going to beat all the odds and it'll all be fine. Right. Because that feels not necessarily like the healthiest either. Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I wonder about with anticipatory grief is talking with our people about it. Because I think that like we think here and we're talking about death, I think about the grieving of that. But I have led anticipatory grief sessions for caregivers and had the patients themselves come and say, I am anticipating my own, I'm already grieving my own death. Like I know that I will die young and I'm grieving that. Yeah. Or like with you and like with what situation you've talked about like not having the kids and the grandkids around, like, is that something that you and Sarah have talked about and that you have said, like, this is something I'm grieving? Like, is that a conversation the two of you have had?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something we've talked about and talk about a lot. Well, I mean, not a lot, but it's a familiar conversation because we both feel that. And I guess I don't know the experience of, because she's not, it's not a terminal condition that she has. Like we don't have that conversation about her death. And so it feels like maybe what we're talking about would be maybe easier because it's a shared experience that we're both going through that is kind of the same for us. Yeah. And I think it's probably healthy to, as you said, talk to your person about this anticipatory grief. And I wonder, I don't know, going back to the ring theory, like that could be navigating that maybe something just to be kind of sensitive to the fact that, there may be, where are you in the ring with them or are you the first ring out and that's going to depend on your relationship. I don't know if that's easier if they are your spouse because you are each other's person and like there's that there versus if it's, a parent or something like that, how that changes it. But I think that grief in general can feel really lonely. Yeah. And knowing that someone else in the situation is also going through that, not that it makes it easier, but it feels better to know that it's not something that you're just in isolation feeling. Yeah.
Well, and I think in some situations, it's like the elephant in the room that nobody's talking about.
True. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So for you and Sarah, I can see that you're sort of both in it together and you're like,
Mm-hmm.
yep, this is a thing that's sort of equally impacting the two of us. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like in a situation like mine, it feels different because like, you know, obviously like he's anticipating his and I, you know, and I think for some people, they're like, well, I don't want to put that extra burden on my person.
Exactly. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And make them feel bad that their impending death makes me feel sad. You know what I mean? And it's like, but I wonder if you know, we've talked a lot this year about death and how like we don't talk about death in our culture. And so I wonder if how it might be a relief in a way for the person themselves to have someone say like, do you feel anticipatory grief about your own death?
Yeah.
And because they probably don't have many spaces where people let them say that, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I'm picturing the rings and it's like, are we hopping back and forth? Are we, you know, is it like, okay, now you get a time and I'm going to comfort you as you talk about how it feels to you, but then I'm going to hop in the middle and then you're going to comfort me as I talk about how, you know what I mean? And but even if you don't feel, because I hear this a lot from people who are like, I don't feel like I can put that on my person. I feel like it's going to stress them out or it's going to make them feel guilty or it's going to whatever. So if you feel like that's the case for you, listener, you know, certainly then just find somebody else, right? So that you have a space where you can say, this is how I'm feeling, you know, somebody else who's going to get it, who's not going to brightside you. And whether that's like reaching out to one of us or having a session with me or another safe person in your life, but just a place so that it's not just sitting there, you know, and maybe it's another, like, let's say it's another family member who's also feeling some anticipatory grief around the same person. Right. And so maybe you could be in that circle together. Right. Because you kind of understand that. So that's another way to just kind of think about it. But I think, I mean, even me saying out loud, like that was kind of a big deal for me to say out loud, like, here's where my brain went.
Right.
Like, I was like, how much do we have in life insurance policy? Like I was like literally thinking those things and like, oh crap, you know, and there's some power, I think, in a way, and like saying it out loud and then not just keeping that to myself and just knowing that I have this safe person with you and our listening audience to share that with, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
So I was thinking you brought kind of something up with tying this to supporters a little bit, is that it's never a time to brightside.
Never.
But this is absolutely not something to brightside someone on, to say that, well, at least you still have the time with them now or all of that, because like validate what they're feeling. Like this is a time to absolutely validate the grief that they're feeling now and not to try to minimize that or tell them now is not the time to feel that.
I feel like we need t-shirts, we need billboards, we need, just because I feel like every time we're like, what should we tell supporters? It's almost always, don't brightside them.
Right. Yeah.
Don't brightside them. Let them, don't dismiss them, acknowledge their feelings and don't brightside them. But you're right, especially with this.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, because if the listener, this is uncomfortable. I mean, what I shared with you earlier, that it's an uncomfortable thing for you to hear me say.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that the listener is like, I don't know, you know, feels uncomfortable and then just wants to say, well, but then you didn't have to do that because you know, nope. Our brains are already doing that. Like it's already, you know, we're fine in the bright sided department. So I think, yes. So when we think about, we know that they shouldn't brightside. What can they do? One thing I think is to sort of think in advance about what some triggers could be now that you've heard us talk about them today. So let's say you're hosting a graduation party, right? Be aware of how that might be impacting the people who are coming to your party.
Right.
Or a baby shower or whatever, right? And, you know, just sort of think through your guest list and just think like, who might this be hard for today? And give them some grace. So if you have a friend who says, I'm sorry, I'm not able to attend, you know, even if they don't say why, right? Give them some grace to be like, no problem. You know, thanks for letting me know. Or if they have to leave early, or if they're sitting in the corner, or if they're whatever, like, I know it feels like, well, this is our graduation party. It's all about us. Yes. And like, think about your friends who are coming to these events And whether you're the host or you're just attending also, or maybe you know this about a friend and you could say, do you want to go to this together? And that way, if you want to leave, we can leave. Or, just think about what those triggers might be. Or like Father's Day, I thought about it and then I forgot. I'm sorry, because we were dealing with stuff. But I was almost going to text you. Does that count for something?
Yeah, it does. It does.
On Father's Day. And just say like, hey, I know that I wonder if this day might bring up some things for you. And I just want you to know I'm thinking of you. No need to respond. So there's my text a week later.
Thank you. No, that's, I do appreciate that for sure. Another thing, maybe as you're talking about like events and guest lists and stuff like that, is I think maybe just acknowledging, as you're saying goodbye or when you talk to them when they arrive or something, just, I don't know when the time is, but like, thank you for coming. I know that this may have been really hard for you, or just an acknowledgement that it is potentially a difficult thing.
Yeah.
And that you see that and are aware of, their life situation and some of the challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. And that you appreciate the effort that they put in, that this wasn't just like, I'm going to a graduation party on the Sunday. It's like, no, this was like sort of emotionally taxing for me, and certainly don't assume, right?
Right.
But if it's a more obvious kind of thing, I think that's huge. And I think even aside from the anticipatory grief thing, like I think thinking about like as a caregiver, getting you and your person to an event is a big deal.
Yeah.
And so being acknowledged and thanked for that, to say like, hey, I'm sure that it was not easy to get out of the house and to get here. And we just really appreciate that you took the time and the energy to be here. So thank you. That goes a long way.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that sort of bottom line, like grief comes in a lot of different ways. We talked way back about like grieving things from the past, right? Or things that we thought were going to happen that aren't happening. We've talked about like grief at the holidays.
Yeah.
And it's a special kind, right? And some people might think this is like a waste of energy to like, why are you grieving something that hasn't even happened? But I just think like, I don't see it that way. I think I see it as like a healthy, our brains sort of practicing in a way and doing a little dress rehearsal for something that might come. And guess what? If we are proven wrong, fabulous.
Right.
Right? Great. And if we're not, okay, we're prepared, So yes, we can be pulled with the tug of war kind of thing. And I think just to some days be in hope and some days be in acceptance, and just to kind of make sure we have kind of our foot in both worlds and don't get too stuck in either side, but that we're able to really kind of find the balance there.
And I think even just recognizing that these are very dynamic situations as far as your feelings and emotions, and you feel one thing one day that's not, you may swing the other way the next day, and that's okay. That's not, there's nothing wrong that's what's happening within you. Like that's 100% natural that you're bouncing around all over that way, and feeling tension between all of these different directions. And I think too that, like we've talked about a lot lately with your boardroom and the emotions and not ignoring them.
Yeah.
I just think it's good if grief is popping up, don't ignore it. And that's not always fun.
Yeah.
But I think it's healthy to let yourself feel the things that are coming up and not just ignore them.
Because as you've mentioned a number of times, is like that sometimes our emotions pair up together, right?
Yeah.
So it might be anger or sadness or irritability or something. And then once we go into the boardroom, we're like, oh, you're just speaking on behalf of grief there, aren't you? Like grief's kind of hidden in the background, but really it's coming out as irritability. Right. So to use that, like just going into the boardroom, all right, mic's open. Who wants to talk? And seeing if grief is around, and if grief's hanging out by himself, or if grief is showing up with a friend or whatever that is. And never to be like, grief, what are you doing here? Everything's fine right now, but to realize that like we can start grieving things before they happen.
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right. Thank you for this powerful conversation.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your experience.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. All right. And we'll get a support group on the books so that we can all talk about this as a group, because I think this would be a good one to talk about with others as well. So yeah, watch for that. Okay. All right. Thanks, friend. I'll see you soon.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to In Sickness. Find us online at insickness.care or on Instagram at insicknesspodcast. You can send your questions and comments to insicknesspodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend or fellow caregiver, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening, and take care.